Welcome to The Global List. This is The Global List, where we travel around the world on unexpected journeys with leaders, thinkers, and innovators. I'm your host, David Solomon Bassiouni, president of the Bassiouni Group, a global consulting firm focused on sustainability, innovation, and impact. Welcome back to the Globalist podcast, and the first of a new series focused on the masculinity crisis. Young men today are in the middle of a crisis that has largely gone unnoticed until recently. The Netflix show Adolescence is lifting the veil, but what's driving the crisis? And what's driving the rise of incel culture, red pill culture, and the so-called Manosphere? What's behind some of the sobering socioeconomic statistics, from loneliness, joblessness, to depression, to self-harm, to violence? What do we need to know? And what do we need to learn? Our guest today is Professor Miriam Lindner, who is a social and evolutionary psychologist who examines violent cognition and the dark sides of human group living. Specifically, her research program spans three main areas: the link between misogyny and mass violence, so-called mandemics, or the disproportionate propensity for certain men to commit mass shootings and self-harm, and the psychological underpinnings of violent extremism. Professor Lindner has numerous degrees, including a master's in neuropsychology from Maastricht University in the Netherlands, PhD in political psychology from Aarhus University in Denmark, and she also completed her postdoctoral fellowship in Harvard's Department of Psychology, where she was mentored by Steven Pinker. Professor Lindner, welcome to the Globalist podcast. Great to have you here. And my first question to you is, have I pronounced your name correctly?
Yes, I think so. I go by Mira. My name is Miriam Lindner, but that doesn't matter all too much. My students know me as Mira, so...
Perfect. I couldn't, I was trying to figure out where I should go for a German or Austrian accent, and I couldn't perfect either. So we just went with that. But thank you for joining us and for this topic and really being the first guest to come on. There's a lot I think we're going to be able to learn from you. But maybe we can start with your background. I covered sort of a quick sketch of your academic background. Can you give us some more in-depth sort of detail in terms of your area of focus, and also, what took you into this really interesting, world? What was the motivation, and what's your background?
Right. So I'm a political and evolutionary psychologist by training. I've always been very interested in combining political science, one of my fields of study, and psychology. And I've always been drawn to the study of extreme forms of aggression, violent extremism, terrorist violence, now violent misogyny. And what motivated me to specialize on this was really a time during the pandemic where I couldn't do my research I had originally set out to do during my postdoc, with the lockdowns and a very high degree of polarization at the time. I wouldn't have gotten the measures that I would have wanted to see. And so I got really curious in the incel community, in extreme male violent cognition. And so it was this mix between, a good amount of curiosity and then also real world urgency that made me kind of look into it. And as an evolutionary psychologist, everything about that community was just screaming evolutionary psychology to me. The focus on mating, the focus on aggression, on retaliation, on status, and so on. And so I adjusted my research program at the time to focus on that.
Interesting. And, the term itself, and I always like to sort of start these podcasts and try and unpack the terms that we discuss, right? And I'm familiar with incel, but I'm guessing most of the listeners may not be. But can you sort of define, what it actually means, the term, what it comes from, and what is the categorization or the definition of incel and incel culture?
Of course. So incel is short for involuntary celibate, and the term refers to members of mostly online subcultures where predominantly heterosexual men conglomerate. It's always men. And they define themselves by their inability to find a romantic or sexual partner despite desiring one. And so in psychological terms, being an incel isn't any form of official diagnosis or clinical condition. It's more a self-identification born out of chronic social rejection and frustration, essentially. And so incels congregate in online fora, communities where they share with the community their grievances. They often focus on their lack of sexual or romantic success. Discourse in these fora is characterized by really profound levels of hopelessness, bitterness, frequently outright misogyny and anger as well. So incels are sexually and romantically aggravated men, disenfranchised men who feel left behind in the sexual marketplace, if you will.
So there's sort of the emergence of this community, right? As you described, sort of self-identified, right? A self-identified group that has, or community that's propagated online. What's driven that growth of it? Is it the technology? Is it the online only, quote unquote, culture? The fact that, they're able to congregate online in these groups and therefore reinforce some of those grievances, or actually, connect to like-minded individuals. What's driving it in that sense? And I'll follow up with a second question.
Mm-hmm. So I think there are two parts to this question. How did this community come about in the first place, I guess? And then how does it function as an echo chamber in current society, right? So would you like me to talk about the second one or the...
I think the first one, to get a sense of kind of what is the sort of the origin of it, because thinking back, and where I first heard of this is, I think it was connected to a mass shooting event. And I remember this may be going back maybe 10 years, and maybe that's going back too far, but I think that's when I first heard of it, because the person that was the shooter was somebody who's described themselves as an incel. And then for a moment, there was some, media attention in terms of, okay, what's this about? But I don't think anyone really has got to grasp it in terms of where did it emerge from?
You're probably referring to Elliot Rodger, right, in California. The origin of the incel fora that we know today actually dates back a little bit more. So, and it actually has very surprising roots. The term involuntary celibate was actually coined in the late 1990s by a Canadian woman known as Alana. And she started Alana's Involuntary Celibacy Project in 1997, I believe, as a support forum for lonely people of all genders, not just men. And it wasn't any movement characterized by misogyny or any of the trends that we're seeing today. It was a really compassionate space for anyone who felt unlucky in love, And so in the 2000s, and then especially in the 2010s, the culture around that term really changed a whole bunch. And so online forums became dominated by young men and took a darker turn, So we had at the time, 4chan's. There were certain boards on 4chan and then on Reddit. And so when Elliot Rodger in 2014 committed his, the massacre in California, this is when some manifestos were emerging in which he called himself an incel. And, there were some videos where he was raging at women for rejecting him. And so he explicitly identified himself by his inability to find a girlfriend as a motive at the time. And so in incel forums then, Rodger was, and when you look at it now, still is actually venerated as a kind of dark folk hero. This is how a lot of it came about. And so, sometimes incels will refer to him as Saint Elliot. And then Alec Manassian in 2018 carried out the van attack in Toronto, and he killed 10 people. And he had posted on Facebook about an incel rebellion just before the attack. And so these attacks are very frequently picked up on these fora. There were some other, mass shootings or other events that were perpetrated by self-identifying incels. And so in part, this is why the community has gained a lot of attention in this context.
And when I'm looking at sort of these milestones, right? Elliot Rodger and the incident in Toronto and these other ones that you mentioned, they're sort of now seen as dark, folk heroes that are venerated online. I'm trying to sort of put together two threads. One is sort of the growth of this community online, and the fact that it's sort of self-propagating and organically or not growing online. And then, sort of looking at some of these other, call it socioeconomic, trends and stats that are out there. And sort of researching this, we just looked at some of these stats, which again, don't seem to find their way into sort of the general mainstream coverage, looking at things like male labor force participation, for example. So we look at that, and the participation rate for prime age men was 97.1% in 1960, fell to 88.6 in 2022, and 14% of millennial males at age 25 not in the labor force. Graduation rates, women graduating, particularly bachelors, graduating at a much higher rate than men. So both enrollment and graduation. So there's a gap there too. Looking at friendships, and this is where we'll go into this some more. But there's a 2021 study from American Perspectives that looked at men's social circles, and they found was that men, suffered this huge decline. So 30 years ago, 55% of men reported having 6 close friends. Now it's been cut in half.
And there is a very interesting literature on, male versus female friendships and how they differ in terms of quality,
Right. And so when we look at these trends, right, and what's been happening, is it just that, these trends have been taking place really since the 70s and happening, and there's this crisis has sort of been happening in the background, but the growth of the online community, and you mentioned 4chan, which I think people sort of have forgotten about how influential that was for a while, or at least in recruiting people. But the fact that you have, these trends were taking place, and then you have the growth of online communities, which therefore maybe has that fueled the growth of it? Has that intensified it? What is sort of the online only, mode given us in terms of defining this community?
I think that this is one of the contributing factors that we see when it comes to this movement. I've explained this in my paper, where I highlight basically the interaction of 3 forces that explain the emergence of incel-like phenomena in society. And I do believe that there is something to be said about changing dynamics and gender equality, which of course is a good thing. It's one of the greatest accomplishments of our time, right? That women are more in charge of their lives, that they are pursuing careers, etc. But we do see these discrepancies increasingly. Young men today, on average, are less likely to be college educated than young women, for example. They are more likely to be unemployed or underemployed, more likely to live with their parents well into their 20s, right? We see these trends. And then in addition, we are seeing how this seeps into expectations about relationships, which is, I'm very interested in mating dynamics, right, as an evolutionary psychologist. So when we see that women can take care of themselves, that they're focusing on their careers, that they expect certain things from a partner, I think that can contribute to increased grievances among men who feel like they are losing out, quote unquote.
And when you have that dynamic, right, the sort of the underlying overt and explicit grievances, right, that are there, I think there's also this, another, let's call it sort of a not parallel, but maybe it's a joint phenomenon, right, online, which is more recently, maybe, which is sort of red pill culture, right, the Manosphere. And I think there's a degree to which, at least just from observing it, that the grievance is there, right? It's sort of inherent in the incel world, and there are many contributors to it. But it also seems like we now have another dynamic, which is you have the sort of red pill culture and the manosphere, which is perfectly positioned to exploit that grievance, right? To be able to then capture that grievance, monetize it, take it to a place where it reinforces the community, it seems like, but it's exploiting that grievance. So what are your thoughts on that component now coming in? And all these terms you know about, and most people may not know about, sexual marketplace, and all of these things that really were sort of brought in by this red pill culture.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I'm not entirely sure if the red pill movement is essentially a breeding ground or if it is in part a result of the dynamics of the sexual marketplace. But I think that the red pill and then some other pills, quote unquote, on incel fora do capture these grievances quite accurately, right, from what they're describing. So um, I would say that they do represent a breeding ground. It's always the kind of shared narrative, right, that feminism has gone too far, that women by nature only desire a small percentage of dominant, high value, quote unquote, men, which is often referred to as hypergamy, that average men are being unjustly shut out, right? This is the idea. And so, um, in a way, it's a mirror of what they're lamenting, right? So I'm unsure as to whether to call it a result or a cause of what we're seeing, if that makes sense.
Right. Because in a sense, these are two dynamics that possibly really feed on each other, right? As you said, one could be the outcome, or one could be the precursor to it. But the idea of the sexual marketplace, and the idea that that sense of grievance, that okay, it's a certain percentage of men that have access, or a certain percentage of men that are thriving. It creates, I would imagine, a sort of self-fulfilling, circular narrative, right? That's it. So how do you, from your perspective as a researcher, and when you're looking at ways in which to sort of access or insights into this community, how do you prepare your research, and how do you get access to really understanding what's happening in terms of who's being attracted, who's being sort of recruited, right? What's the profile of the individuals that are recruited into this world? How do they behave online? How does that shape, or how is your research being shaped because of this, world, which is very, very different than anything that we know?
Right. I do think that you see certain pipelines on there, right? When you familiarize yourself with certain online subcultures, it's at first almost like learning a new language, right? And so there's definitely a learning curve of sorts. And I think, what you said earlier about this breeding ground, I do, when thinking about immersing myself in these subcultures, what stands out is that there is some sort of pipeline, right? You have some sort of philosophical groundwork that the incel community builds on. And when you are asking me about how young people kind of end up in these online spaces, you can see that there is very often, the red pill adherents that encourage young men to do something, right? They could hit the gym, learn game like pickup techniques, or assert dominance in certain ways. So incels will often say that it's hopeless, but I can still see how there is some sort of pipeline where these red pill ecosystems that you see across different online spheres, the manosphere, and then the incel ecosystem bleed into each other, right? So for example, you might have a young man starting to consume red pill content, if you will, on YouTube, on Reddit. Maybe they just want to increase their dating success. They maybe want to vent about rejection. And then you have a bit of a gateway, right? So you kind of end up with, people maybe stumbling upon a forum, right, where the narrative, where the rhetoric is much harsher. And so instead of feeling alienated by it, maybe they might end up feeling seen, if you will. So to go back to that, I think that there is that holds some water. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some articles that were published that kind of show that the steps you need to take if you end up on that algorithm, that the amount of steps required to end up on incel fora is actually very small. So it happens very quickly.
And I like that you mentioned the pipeline and the pathways. I had a conversation last year, a podcast focused on terrorism, and we discussed this idea of, or rather the topic of, what is the pipeline and what's the pathway? And my question was, what is the pathway? Singular. And, my guest responded that actually, no, there's pathways, we can define what they are, right? But there are pathways to radicalization and so on. And so I think the pipeline thing is key, and I'm sort of keeping that up there. And then something else you mentioned, which is this ecosystem of this world, right? And when you're right, I mean, you look at some of the dynamics here that have sort of fused, right? Dating coaches, pickup artists, fitness coaches, but also increasingly alt-right political content. So it seems as if all of that has sort of neatly fused into this pipeline. As you mentioned, the steps are shorter, right? The pipeline is much shorter to get to where they are. In your work and in kind of defining, is there such a thing as sort of profiling the individuals that may be more susceptible to falling into the pipeline? Is that a fair question to ask, or is there a broad outline as you say, okay, well, this is the kind of individual that might be at risk of, going into this pipeline and becoming more radicalized?
On the one hand, I do believe that there are certain risk factors. On the other hand, I'm always a little hesitant to kind of say that, like any ecosystem, you have a lot of different individuals in that ecosystem, right? So it's certainly true that a lot of self-identifying incels are socially isolated, for example, or that they have experienced that they have not had any sort of success in terms of sexual or romantic relationships. But some of them, have jobs. They attend college. They might not outwardly appear like they're misfits, right? So one thing about the incel community or any sort of red pill identity is that it can be hidden in online life. So I would be hesitant to say that every lonely young man will automatically identify as an incel and then by extension become a violent misogynist. I would think that's a sweeping generalization. So, which brings us to another issue, the idea that very often mass violence and the incel community are very much conflated, but most incels do not commit these acts or any crimes, right? Many of them wallow in self-pity, and they are way more likely to be depressed or suffer from other mental health issues that are worth examining, right? So I think we need to be careful that there are two sides to this coin. And that's something that I'm always eager to kind of point out,
And I think that's a really great point, because I think in a topic, like this, which is obviously thorny and complicated, there's a lot of nuance, and I think a lot of misperceptions and perceptions as to what goes on. Because I think maybe the mainstream perception is that incel necessarily denotes violence, and like you're saying, that's not necessarily the case. There are different ways to look at it. One of the just on this issue of violence, you wrote a paper, I believe, called "Sense in Senseless Violence: Male Reproductive Strategy in the Sexual Marketplace," to kind of show that link, right? In some cases, the link between extreme misogyny and violence. What were some of the key learnings there that you found in terms of sort of key indicators or trends that you saw?
It's a theoretical paper explaining how, how extreme misogyny can result in mass violence, and how movements like the Incel movement can emerge when certain conditions are met. So really, it's providing some evolutionary psychological lens on a phenomenon that very often is discussed in gender studies or with reference to, the female empowerment only. Not that they are mutually exclusive, but I do think that we need to look at evolved male psychology and how it can be conducive to certain parameters in the environment. And when these parameters are kind of, coming together in a unique way, that it can flip a switch, if you will, in the male mind. So this is really what my paper is about.
It is a specialized area. Do you find that the broader research into this area, is it limited? Is it growing? Because again, it's an issue that's been out there. But do you feel that there's more interest in academic interest in terms of trying to address and uncover and analyze some of these trends?
Yes, I see it a lot in my own community among evolutionary psychologists, and I think it's in part because, at least for me, I don't see the incel movement in the sensationalist sense, right? I don't approach them and think, "Wow, this is odd. This is morbid in certain ways." I view them as a very unique window into extreme male violent cognition that allows us to study some of the assumptions that we would put forward as evolutionary psychologists. And so for me, it's basically a case study. And I do think that we're seeing quite an uptick in publications on it. I cannot say that all of them are coming from that same angle, but I think it's valuable, and it tells us something about the urgency of having to address certain trends that we're seeing, especially for the modern man, if you will.
Right. You've also, I think, taken steps to develop an assessment tool to identify individuals that might be at risk of hurting themselves or going down that line. What is that sort of toolkit or look like? I know, without giving up too much information or IP, but what does that look like, and what sort of motivated you to develop this kind of assessment tool?
It's in progress, and I've actually taken a step back to produce a bit of another theoretical framework, because we still have to identify, or we still have to explain actually why men on average are way more likely to die by suicide than women, and also to be more expressively violent, right, when it comes to mass shootings, and what the conceptual overlap is there. And so to explain that sex difference, I think will lay that groundwork. But what I'm interested in is in saying, okay, men are both more likely to die by suicide and to commit these horrific acts. How do we know when somebody is leaning toward one of these behavioral strategies over another? And I think that will have a big impact and, really contribute to our understanding. But first, we need to understand why male psychology is more likely to actually die by suicide, and in response to what grievances. I have some ideas about this, and I'm working on it. So this will basically be my counterpart to my last theoretical paper on male psychology and extremism. So both sides of the same coin, and we have to discuss both in the same breath, basically.
Well, I'm just going to put a pin in that, and maybe that's a follow-up episode for that one. But it's it's interesting just looking at sort of the landscape, because the work that you're doing is taking place within this broad landscape of right-wing, alt-right-wing movements, maybe sort of a counter movement against fourth wave feminism, against Me Too, right? So there's a lot of things that are happening culturally and politically at the same time, and then on top of it, economically as well, right? We talked earlier on about the economic fortunes of some of these men. So that, I suppose, gives you sort of this broad canvas, right, in which you're working to look at all these trends. Which trends do you think are most impactful in terms of not necessarily shaping incel culture, but impacting young men right now? Are we really looking more at some of these socioeconomic trends that are deepening isolation, maybe deepening that sense of loneliness? Is it something like the loneliness epidemic, which is impacting everyone, or globally, and technology, or is it some of these more mundane but important sort of factors like socioeconomic achievement and joblessness? Are there any sort of trends that you could pick out and say, okay, we need to pay attention to XYZ because that's what's really impacting some of the issues in this community, or this is what's impacting young men right now? And of course, this is on top of self-perception, self-idealization, and all of those other things. But you're just interested to see sort of what, from a trends perspective, you think sort of jump out.
So to talk about trends, I think what's really important is to talk about the foundation on which these trends feed, right? And so what do we mean when we talk about that foundation? When we talk about evolved male psychology, what we mean is that males of many species, including humans, will respond to certain types of grievances with aggressive behaviors, with coercion. And so very often these grievances pertain to sexual failure. So when we look back at our ancestral past, essentially, males who were cut off from any sort of reproductive opportunities would take high-risk strategies like, fighting rivals, coercing mates, because there's nothing to lose. And so when we look at that male psychology, we will see that it gets triggered by certain trends or certain environmental parameters, right? So when we look at the sexual marketplace, and I think this is what you were getting at some of the developments that we're seeing, the mating landscape we're seeing today, mating and dating, is very different from how it used to be, right? So we have things like online dating. We have some societal factors like changing gender roles, later marriages, and so on. So we see that, and to kind of go back to what we talked about at the beginning, we see that women have more autonomy. We can choose more. We're also by nature the choosier sex. This is not just some sort of anecdote, right? And so we amplify these, and suddenly you end up in the population with an abundance or a surplus of men who will not find a partner. And so their psychology gets engaged and says, I don't like that. I'm going to try and recalibrate my standing by maybe engaging in harassment or, in other forms of aggressive behavior. And sometimes that can kind of tip into something else. So I really think it's the kind of conversion of a male psychology that is very sensitive to mating and perceived failures in that domain, changing social forces like female empowerment, autonomy, and so on, changes in the sexual marketplace. A lot of high status men will, a few high status men will obtain most partners, leaving others shut out, which creates de facto polygyny, which means that basically male aggressive tendencies will be triggered even more. And then you have online communities, to kind of go back to the very beginning. You have online communities, suddenly you have echo chambers full of other people who suffer from similar grievances. The narrative becomes accepted. You can air it out. And you are being fed with more of that content. And I think you have a very combustive kind of mix there. But I do not think we can only look at social forces or socioeconomic status. All of these discussions need to be had with the peculiarities, if you will, of an evolved male psychology.
So would you say then you have the underlying biological drive? Let's say that. I'll just speak from my amateur perspective here, but this sort of underlying biological drive of mating, right? That the sort of that drive that's there, now forced to deal with a completely restructured sexual marketplace in which, like you said, there's a hierarchy, or there's a disproportionate luck, let's call it that, or disproportionate experiences, and then countered also with increased independence, social economic mobility on the part of women. That may be also perceived as a threat, right, to those individuals that are not lucky, right? So you're right. It does seem like a combustible or mix of things. One of the things what I'd be curious to get your thoughts on this, which maybe is tied to this, is the sort of construct online of the alpha males, beta males, which seems to get a lot of currency in these communities, right? To me, that seems as if it's further reinforcing that, right? It's further sort of trying to construct a perception of traditional masculinity, right? That finds currency in these groups, but again, it's not the healthy version of it, but there's currency that they find in that sort of alpha beta construct online, which again, it seems to be self-propagating, right? It's almost a closed loop, because they can say, well, so and so is not having luck, they're being pushed out of society, and therefore we just need to protect our own. I guess it comes back to this whole thing of how do you, as you said, it's important to look at all the peculiarities of all this, right? In context. But if there is this self-propagating narrative online, online and offline, how is that at some point broken down, or how do you intercept that? And that's looking at the long-term perspective of young men, young boys. How do you break that cycle for them, or how do you begin to address it?
You actually said something very interesting, about the alpha and beta kind of distinction and masculine ideas. And something that I find very interesting is that a lot of what's written in my academic community in evolutionary psychology finds its way onto Incel fora, where they have a very big fascination with ideas from evolutionary psychology about mating and attractiveness. So, when we publish articles that say, on average, women will prefer this size of a biceps over another one, or symmetric faces over asymmetric faces, and so on, a certain height. It seems that these are being picked up often out of context, right? And so, yes, there are certain things that we find on average more attractive, but in a world where it's more about really choosing, because we will look for other qualities in a partner that are probably, that fly under their radar. So when you go onto Incel fora, you see that there's this obsession with looks maxing, right? Going to the gym, facially reconstructing, they're reconstructing their facial features, working out and so on, when these are not things that most women will actually look for, right? And so I think that one of the problems is that these findings are kind of being appropriated in a way that kind of perpetuates this idea that it's all about looks, that it's all about, money and status, etc. And I think, it's problematic because ultimately what they end up with is that you end up in this community and then you only listen to other men who consume that kind of literature, right? To say it very bluntly. And so that's one thing. And I think this is why it's so important to kind of try and dismantle that Andrew Tate idea of, if you're dominant, if you're kind of like towering over a woman, if you are, forcing her to be this or that's somehow attractive to us. Of course, most women will vehemently disagree with that. And to kind of have some sort of dialogue where I'm not exactly sure how to go about this, to be honest. I think we're already trying to do a whole bunch, and I think the fact that it's so hard to get through is a huge argument for the evolutionary psychology behind it. If it wasn't, it would be easier to toggle and to adjust, if you will,
But at least in a sense, your work and the work that you're doing is helping to penetrate, right? To begin to kind of expose, right? Because, again, these issues, even the terms that we've mentioned here today, everything from incel to sexual marketplace and so on, are to even incel, are still not as well understood in the mainstream, and I think they need to be. And I think there is the understanding of the likes of the Tate brothers and so on out there as well. And I think part of the challenge here, and I think it falls on men, as well, is to actually to be having those conversations, right? I think, just speaking from my perspective, there's a generational dynamic to it as well, in which when we talk about male friendship and having those conversations, you could easily define generationally which generations are much easier and open to having those conversations, right? Or having conversations about mental health. There's a change there, I think, and I'm a Gen Xer, and so, without dating myself, but there's a difference between how I relate to my colleagues, close friends, male friends, versus maybe how a millennial or a Gen Zer might relate, because they grew up in a digital world, and it's a different. So I think the conversations need to happen. I think it's also in a cross-generational way to figure out, okay, why is it that an Andrew Tate appeals to a kid who's 15, who's feeling left out, right? I think the more that we begin to think through why those ideas gain currency, and the more we're able to then access and figure out exactly what's going on, because to me it feels like the crisis doesn't go away until we really do some soul searching and some going into it with open minds and open hearts as well.
Mm-hmm. And then practicing metacognition, it's the one thing that I will always talk about. I think once you are aware of kind of how your mind works and what it is, in this sense, by evolution designed, quote unquote, to do and to respond to, can introduce a moment of pause where you say, oh, it's okay that I feel that way, but I don't necessarily have to act on that, right? We do it all the time in everyday life. I mean, it's normal to react strongly to certain grievances. It's normal and human to have biases and stereotypes, but whether or not we actually act on them is a separate issue that is under our deliberate control. So my biggest hope will be to, tell people about how male psychology works and why it is particularly sensitive to certain types of grievances, and to instill that moment of pause. That would be my biggest. If I could run an intervention, it would have to do with that.
Right. Well, I always have a last question to get to, and I think you sort of got to it as well, which is, what if you look at your work and that you've done the work that you're doing right now? What is it that you would sort of want to leave behind in terms of some kind of legacy in the work that you're doing? What is it you would want achieved? What sort of the bigger outcome from it? That would be my very simple, easy last question for you.
You say it's an easy question, but I think when you do research, what do you hope to do? You hope to have an impact, right? No matter what that means. And one of the things personally, being an evolutionary psychologist, we get misunderstood a lot. You would be surprised by, how many misconceptions there are about our field. So my biggest hope is really to show that it is a very suitable framework to explain a lot of the things that we're seeing in our modern environment, in our social interactions, in society. And so, if anything, I hope that my work contributes to that, and to maybe show that, no human behavior is really foreign or strange that way. Everything we do ultimately was designed to have a purpose. And sometimes that purpose is no longer, it doesn't match the modern environment anymore. And so really the only thing we can do, you cannot change the course of evolution within 50 or 100 years or even 1,000 years, right? So in the meantime, what we will have to do is to be cognizant of the things our mind is designed to do and how sometimes it misfires in the here and now. I think that would be it.
I love it. It's a understanding the mind and our mind, our evolutionary impulses, right? And how it relates to the modern world and this issue. Well, not just this issue, but I think this has just been fantastic, and I would certainly like to think that this is sort of beginning of ongoing conversation, because I think there's a lot more we can learn. Yeah, we can certainly learn from you. So, want to thank you for spending your time and giving us your insights. And I look forward to more conversations.
Same here.
Thank you.
Excellent.
All right. I hope you've enjoyed this latest episode of the Globalist podcast. We're off to fuel the jet for the next adventure. Until then, be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, and be sure to follow our new YouTube channel at the GL Podcast, new Instagram account at the Globalist Podcast, and our new TikTok at the GL Podcast. As always, stay tuned for more unexpected journeys with leaders, thinkers, and innovators.